So now we introduce the man who has been variously described as the Red Emperor, Mao Zedong. Now, the fact that he is described as the Red Emperor is somewhat ironic because Mao wasn't an emperor at all. He was the general secretary of the Communist Party of the People's Republic of China. This is going to be his origin story, and by the end of it, you will probably understand why he's described as an emperor. At least that's the hope, right? So, first off, communism and China are sort of awkward bedfellows. Communism revolves around mobilizing a working class and basically having them overthrow the bourgeoisie and then implementing a dictatorship of the working class. What does China not really have? Well, a working class. So how are you going to make this work? Um, Mao was influenced by a socialist intellectual by the name of Li Dezhou, who argues that Chinese peasants can actually be mobilized and turn to communism instead. Mao's going to carry that philosophy and ideology with him for basically the rest of his life. In 1921, the Chinese Communist Party is created, and young Mao Zedong was a member. Then, later on, there's this awkward sort of truce that Chiang Kai-shek and the communists hammer out so they can jointly unify their efforts against the Japanese. Until Chiang in 1927 says, just kidding, and he executes Order 66, betrays the communists, attacks them in Shanghai, and basically pushes them out. Those communists who survived Chiang's purge have to flee to the western province of Shaanxi. This is what is called the Long March, where nearly 90,000 communists, communist intellectuals, politicians, soldiers, etc., march thousands of miles to escape the KMT, or Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang. And out of that 90,000, as few as 4,000, or maybe as many as 30,000, actually survive. This is actually super important if you want to understand the current sort of political makeup of the modern People's Republic of China, because basically the survivors of the Long March, they become very tightly knit. They become very close with one another, and they form sort of the ruling class of almost communist aristocrats. I know that sounds like a contradiction in terms, but that's what it really is. So the descendants of the Long March sort of agree to help each other out, help each other advance their careers, get jobs, etc. So this forms sort of the ruling cadre of communist officials that will one day control and govern the People's Republic of China. So now that the communists are out of the way, Chiang basically allies himself with the communists once again during the Second World War, also called the Second Sino-Japanese War, to fight the Japanese invaders. Now, the way this works is I'm going to give you two versions of history. There is the official version of history as related by the People's Republic of China, and then there's, what actually happened. So, in the official People's Republic of China history, basically what happens is that Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT were incredibly corrupt and inefficient, and they were losing against the Japanese. So what happens is that Mao Zedong becomes leader of the Chinese Communist Party, and he leads a plucky band of followers in the province of Shaanxi, and his followers, mostly being peasants, launch this guerrilla war against the Japanese. It drives the Japanese out, leads to the Japanese getting defeated, and after the war is over, after the Second World War is over, that is, Mao and the communists turn their attention to Chiang Kai-shek and defeat him. And they defeat him because Chiang is corrupt and incompetent. Okay, so that's the official version of the People's Republic of China. Here's more or less what actually happens. Basically, the Japanese and the KMT slaughter each other. It's a big, long, messy war with incredibly high casualties. And while that's happening, Mao and the communists are basically hiding out in Western China, and they just kind of let that happen. It is true that Mao and his followers launched some attacks against the Japanese, but basically they were incredibly small compared to the scale of the war between Japan and the KMT. So what happens is, as the war sort of goes on, it degrades Shang's ability to effectively lead a state. The KMT becomes incredibly chaotic, disorganized, and yes, it does become corrupt, but a lot of that corruption is because of the fact that the KMT are engaged in a very devastating and long war with Japan. So what happens is that after the end of the Second World War, Mao and the communists emerge from Western China. They're organized, they're trained, they're ready to go, and the KMT is just absolutely exhausted, even though they have more troops. So what happens is that Mao increasingly gains support of the peasantry, and Shang's army gets defeated in 1949. Shang and the Kuomintang flee to the island of Taiwan, and there they become a government in exile. So we have a situation where Taiwan sort of calls itself the Republic of China, but mainland China is basically the People's Republic of China. People's Republic of China is a communist state. The Republic of China isn't really much of a republic. It's at first kind of a military dictatorship, but it gradually becomes more democratic as time goes on. Speaking of the war between Japan and China, let's talk about what's going on with Japan during the interwar period. And what's going on is basically this. So in 1923, a magnitude 8 earthquake hits the island of Honshu, and basically the earthquake is focused around the most populated areas in Japan. So Tokyo and Yokohama, that are basically two large cities that are practically merged together anyway. So this earthquake, called the Great Kanto earthquake, manages to kill over 100,000 people. Now, this is one of those issues where we have to ask, is this a correlation, or did the Great Kanto earthquake cause something? Because I'm going to give you the facts. Before the Great Kanto earthquake, Japan wasn't a perfect democracy, but it was gradually adopting aspects of Western culture that we've talked about, especially in government, especially in the military, that kind of thing. It was increasingly adopting Western fashions. All of those things were happening. Then, after the Great Kanto earthquake, after the Great Kanto earthquake, Japan fundamentally changes. It becomes much more militaristic. It takes the code of Bushido much more seriously. And it seems as if the military becomes the most powerful institution in Japan. Not just because they have guns and all that, but because they actually become the governing class. You have a series, or at least one prime minister, who's actually assassinated by military officers. So basically the civilian government of Japan becomes almost entirely subordinated to the wishes of the military. Another factor that may have influenced Japan's turn to militarization was the Great Depression, because desperate times call for desperate measures. Regardless, even before the Great Depression, Japan had been sort of looking outwards and asserting a much more aggressive foreign policy. We see that in World War I, where Japan basically swoops in and takes a bunch of German-held islands in the Pacific and German possessions in China. It's around that time period that Japan proposes the 21 demands to China, which would basically reduce China to a protectorate. Remember, this had to have been a very bitter pill for the Chinese to swallow, because during the Tang Dynasty, Japan itself was a protectorate of China. In 1931, Japan invades the northern province of Manchukuo, or Manchuria. Manchukuo was one of the most industrialized areas of China, and basically Japan's excuse for invading Manchukuo is that it sort of stages an attack on its own railway system, and it argues that in order to protect its railways, it needs to send troops to occupy Manchukuo. Manchukuo becomes a puppet state within the Japanese Empire, ruled, interestingly, by the displaced former emperor of China, Puyi. Then the next data point comes in 1937 when Japan formally invades the rest of China. And you can kind of see that Japan takes the capital city of Peking or Beijing, and it also takes the city of Shanghai. It basically occupies lots of these coastal regions. Eventually, Japan tries to argue that this empire that it forms is actually a greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, which admittedly is a mouthful, and it's not explicitly a Japanese empire. It's an empire that's based around pan-Asian ideas. And what's interesting is that a lot of people in East Asia bought into this idea, but in most cases, being under Japanese occupation and the reality of Japan's very harsh occupation sort of destroyed what little faith there was that the Japanese empire was pan-Asian. It most certainly was not. So now we come to the dark times. Now we come to the rise of fascism. Fascism is the ultimate F word in politics because frequently I observe that, in the United States right now, both Republicans and Democrats are accusing one another of being fascist. And the reason they do that is because saying that somebody is a fascist is a very powerful insult because it associates them, among other things, with the Nazis. That being said, I find that the people who frequently use the term fascist as an insult very often don't understand what fascism is. So here's what fascism is. Fascism is fake communism. So after the First World War and after the Great Depression, basically you had this sense among ordinary people that the wealthy, that the traditional ruling class of Europe had bungled things, that they were irresponsible. And whereas wealthy people in the Great Depression lost parts of their fortune, ordinary people may have lost their ability to make a living. And in places like the United States, remember, at first, government aid was provided not to ordinary people, but to the big economic producers, like Herbert Hoover's RFC, that basically gave government subsidies to big corporations, more or less. That creates a lot of resentment. There's also a lot of resentment left over from the First World War. The idea that an entire generation of people had been wasted to advance the interests of imperialists, of the upper class, of old monarchs. And people were just very, very angry about that. So if you are a conservative, very much somebody who believes in preserving European civilization as it is, you have a problem. And that problem is that communism and socialism are about as popular as sliced bread right now. So what these right-wing European traditionalists start wondering is, how do you get lower-class people and middle-class people affected by the Great Depression, how do you get them to vote for a right-wing party? And the answer is this. You create a welfare state. You give them some of the economic policies that were championed by socialists and communists. You give them, in other words, you adopt some aspects of socialism and communism into your party. But that's where the similarities end. Because if you remember, communism, for example, is a political philosophy that tries to, above all else, emphasize that there is a unity among the working class people of the world. That the difference between, for example, a German worker and a French worker, those differences are all artificial. In fascism, it's not about the working class, it's about the nation. So, for example, the Nazi Party is called the National Socialist German Workers' Party, not the National Socialist Party. Um, so note the term national and German. So, for example, this is a party for German workers. If you are Jewish, you need not apply, for example. The first fascist leader to emerge is Benito Mussolini, who interestingly was actually a communist beforehand, but he, like many in Italy, are disillusioned by the outcome of the First World War, and his goal is to restore Italy to basically the height of its past. He manages to form a massive movement, and in 1922, he marches on the capital of Rome and basically puts pressure on the King of Italy to appoint him prime minister, which is a position he occupies from 1922 until, well, depending upon your geopolitical perspective, either 1943 or 1945. One of the reasons that Mussolini is so effective at applying pressure is that most fascist movements don't shy away from using violence to achieve their ends. Mussolini had a force of basically thugs, or you could even, if you want to be diplomatic, you can say bodyguards, called the squadristi. Later on, they're called the black shirts because of their uniforms. So these guys would go and eliminate opponents. They would spread nationalistic propaganda. And eventually, under Mussolini's leadership, you have government-directed economic programs and a very aggressive foreign policy. Under Mussolini's rule, Italy becomes rebranded as like the new Roman Empire. All right, more on that in just a second. But the other important part of fascism is it advertises itself as a corporate state. That doesn't mean that it becomes like Microsoft or Apple. What it basically means is that in a capitalist system, corporations and individuals are supposed to be just that. They're supposed to basically be in the private sphere. In socialism, the state basically controls the means of production. In the corporate state, basically all of the big economic and social players are brought into the government, and the government basically organizes them. So in 1935, Mussolini attacks and invades Ethiopia, almost loses, but has to actually use chemical weapons in order to clinch the victory. Like everything else, the League of Nations condemns this, but ultimately it does not take action. One thing that we have to remember is that Mussolini and Hitler are not individuals that just swoop in out of nowhere and like kidnap the future of Europe. Fascism is a trend. You see fascist movements and governments not only forming in Germany and Italy, but in places like Spain, Portugal, Hungary, Romania, Croatia. Tons of states in Western and Central Europe start either flirting or adopting fascism, or start adopting what I would call fascist-adjacent militaristic governments. Finally, let's talk about this guy. And remember that as fascist dictators go, Hitler is a relative latecomer, but he's also sort of fascism's culmination. So Hitler emerges during the aftermath of World War I, feeling a sense of alienation and kind of listlessness. In World War I, everything was clear. Germany had a purpose. Now everything just kind of feels strange. And also the Treaty of Versailles was also a bitter pill for Germans to swallow. So too was the Great Depression. So Hitler forms or becomes the leader of the Nazi Party before 1933. Before he becomes the party leader of the Nazis, he's basically this kind of political agitator, known for extraordinary public speaking capabilities, and he really uses his ability to captivate a crowd to propel himself to leadership within the Nazi Party. So it's 1933, and the National Socialists, or the Nazis, are running in the parliamentary elections in what was called the Bundestag. So the Nazis end up performing pretty well in the election, but so too do the socialists. So I'm going to spare you a lot of the technical details of how parliamentary governments work and basically simplify it by saying that Germany's president, a former World War I general by the name of Paul von Hindenburg, he gets to choose which party is actually going to govern Germany. So here's what Paul von Hindenburg thinks. He thinks that Hitler's a noob, he's boorish, he's crude, but he also believes that Hitler can be controlled. He believes that the socialists, however, are basically going to be socialist, and that socialism is against the interest of Germany. There are going to be a number of individuals who make the mistake that Hitler could be controlled. Unfortunately for Paul von Hindenburg, and unfortunately for the rest of the world, evil is rarely so nice as to be stupid.